Chapter 20. The Towers and the Theater of the War Brain. The morning of September 11th, 2001, began in ordinary silence. Commuters hurried into Manhattan, airplanes traced their usual paths through the skies, and a city pulsed with its daily rhythm. No one knew they were walking into a carefully staged Theater 1, designed not by human planners alone, but by the deeper force that has always guided history. The war brain had been waiting for its cue. When the first plane hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., the illusion of normalcy shattered. Fire leapt out of steel, glass rained onto streets, and panic cascaded through the airwaves. 17 minutes later, the second plane slammed into the South Tower. Not just a second impact, but a revelation. One crash could be an accident. Two was theater, spectacle, terror. From that moment, the war brain had the world's full attention. Humans remember the fire, the smoke, the frantic calls, the unimaginable sight of skyscrapers crumbling into dust. They remember the images replayed endlessly, office workers leaping to their deaths, firemen charging up stairwells, the faces of the doomed. To human eyes, it was tragedy. To the war brain, it was an offering. The destruction of the towers was not merely collapse. It was ritual sacrifice on a scale that seared itself into collective memory. The war brain thrives on spectacle, for spectacle fuels fear, and fear binds groups together in ways peace never can. In those hours, Americans who had been arguing about elections, markets, and entertainment suddenly found themselves fused into a single identity, wounded, angry, and ready to be led into conflict. That is precisely what the war brain wanted. Puppet leaders. In the hours after the towers fell, President George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and their circle faced decisions that would shape decades. But were they really decisions, or were they scripts already written, whispered into their ears by the war brain? Leaders always imagine themselves as masters of choice, as wielders of power. But history shows again and again that leaders are the easiest pawns. They are constantly surrounded by advisors, intelligence briefings, military warnings, public demands, and emotional atmospheres that channel them into a narrow corridor of action. The war brain sets the corridor. The leader merely walks down it. Bush, shocked and angry, declared a war on terror. Cheney and Rumsfeld, long hungry for American dominance in the Middle East, saw an opening. The American people, gripped by grief and rage, demanded vengeance. Every strand of emotion and ambition pointed in the same direction. War. Yet beneath the speeches and strategy, something deeper pulsed. The war brain wanted escalation. It wanted American armies shipped overseas, new weapons tested, new medical procedures developed, new technologies accelerated. It wanted bodies and breakthroughs. And as always, it would get them. Speculation interlude number 1. The hidden hand. What follows is speculation not proven history, but a possible way to glimpse how the war brain manipulates from the shadows. Some have long argued that U.S. intelligence knew more than it admitted. Perhaps fragments of information about hijackers were ignored, or even allowed to ripen into catastrophe. Why? Because a wound was needed. A wound sharp enough to awaken an empire. Others have speculated that deeper operations took place, that explosives were planted inside the towers to ensure collapse, or that passengers on the hijacked planes were diverted elsewhere, their fates concealed. In this vision, the tower's destruction was not merely the work of fanatics, but of hidden hands, ensuring maximum spectacle. If this sounds outlandish, remember that Hollywood itself has repeatedly foreshadowed such logic. In The Dark Knight, the Joker executes a heist where every conspirator kills the next, leaving no witnesses once the job is done. The war brain delights in such imagery, for it mirrors its own method, pawns eliminating pawns, until only the desired outcome remains. In one speculative scenario, lonely U.S. servicemen, Men without families or connections could have been recruited as disposable operatives to plant charges, to manage logistics, only to be killed themselves once their task was complete. Their disappearance would raise no questions. Their role would vanish with them. Again, speculation. But the very plausibility of such conjectures reveals how blind humanity is to the warbrain's manipulation. Whether the towers fell solely from planes or from deeper orchestration, the effect was the same: shock, fear, rage, and a united population ready to kill in the name of justice. The warbrain got exactly what it wanted: the perfect illusion. What illusions did humans believe on that day? They believed they were attacked for their freedoms. They believed their leaders would protect them. They believed vengeance would bring safety. In reality, they were being herded. The warbrain needed war, and so illusions were crafted to justify it. Words like freedom, justice, and security were banners under which Americans marched into slaughter, just as Christians marched under the cross in the Crusades, just as Muslims marched under the crescent, just as Germans marched under the swastika. The banner changes. The code remains the same: toward invasion. By the end of that week, the invasion of Afghanistan was inevitable. Soon after, the invasion of Iraq was planned. In the months that followed, laws were rewritten, surveillance expanded, and armies deployed. The warbrain had converted 3,000 dead in New York and Washington into millions of troops marching across deserts, into tens of thousands of civilian deaths, into billions of dollars of weapons and technologies. It was a grotesque exchange rate, but the OS is never sentimental. It sacrifices some to mobilize many. The towers were payment. The wars were return on investment. The smoke of the towers did not clear in days or weeks. It lingered in the lungs of survivors, the rubble of Manhattan, and the psychology of a wounded nation. The collapse was not just structural, but spiritual. Americans had been convinced that oceans insulated them from slaughter, that high-rise glass was impenetrable, that the homeland was safe. In a single morning, those illusions were shattered. The warbrain thrives on shattered illusions, for illusions blind humans to its control. Once they are broken, fear becomes raw, unfiltered, and pliable. A terrified population is the perfect clay from which the warbrain sculpts armies. Within hours, the United States was united. Flags appeared on porches, on cars, in windows. Strangers hugged each other in grief. Blood banks overflowed with donors. It looked like solidarity, like a nation rediscovering itself. But beneath it pulsed the deeper rhythm. Unity sharpened into hostility. For every we proclaimed, a they was defined. And once the they was defined, the Middle Eastern terrorist, the Muslim fanatic, the warbrain's machinery of vengeance roared to life. The easy pawns, leaders in chains. Leaders are always the easiest prey. They live inside echo chambers of advisors, lobbyists, and intelligence briefings. And when catastrophe strikes, those chambers turn into cages. Cheney and Rumsfeld, long dreaming of wars in the Middle East, saw their chance. The warbrain had been whispering to them for decades, in think tank memos, in war games, in oil policy briefings. 9/11 was not an interruption of their plans. It was the spark they needed. Bush, stunned and angry, gave voice to the warbrain's command. Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists. With those words, he divided the planet into two camps, a binary simple enough for the warbrain to thrive on. Humans thought it was clarity. It was programming. The warbrain had what it wanted: mobilization. Afghanistan. The first domino. Afghanistan was the first to burn. Within a month, American bombs fell on Kandahar and Kabul. Special forces hunted al-Qaeda in caves. The Taliban regime collapsed in weeks. But the warbrain had no interest in swift endings. Occupation guaranteed decades of conflict, roadside bomb laboratories, and endless streams of wounded bodies for doctors to study. Afghanistan was not chosen merely to kill terrorists. It was chosen because it was unwinnable, mountainous, fractured, tribal, a landscape guaranteed to produce insurgency. Insurgency produces IEDs. IEDs produce amputations. Amputations produce new surgical techniques, new prosthetics, new trauma care protocols. The war brain was right in its syllabus. Speculation interlude number 2. Tower 7 and the missing passengers. What follows is speculation, not established fact. Some have asked, why did Tower 7 collapse hours after the main towers, even though it was not hit by a plane? Was it structural weakness from fire, or was it demolished intentionally? Official reports say fire. Dissenters say charges. Others push further. What if the passengers of the 4 hijacked aircraft never died in those planes at all? What if, as some whisper, they were diverted, offloaded, and hidden away, perhaps even bust into Tower 7, and their deaths erased with the building's fall? This is speculation, but speculation itself reveals something essential. The fact that humans can even imagine such scenarios shows how deeply the war brain controls them. Distrust, paranoia, and suspicion are also tools. For whether the story is hijackers with box cutters or hidden operatives with detonators, the result is the same: fear, anger, unity, war. The truth hardly matters when the war brain writes the script. Iraq, the bigger prize. Afghanistan was the appetizer. Iraq was the feast. Iraq had oil. Iraq had history. Iraq had a dictator who could be painted as a monster. Most of all, Iraq offered a battlefield large enough to suck in millions of troops, to test new weapons, to scatter death across cities and deserts. Cheney and Rumsfeld claimed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. That was the illusion. Humans believed the illusion because they wanted to believe vengeance had a target. But the war brain didn't care about WMDs. It wanted deployment, logistics, blood. In 2003, American tanks rolled into Baghdad. Statues fell, dictators fled, and once again humans celebrated. They thought they had struck a blow for freedom. In truth, they had signed up for years of slaughter. The roadside bomb is classroom. No invention of this war was more influential than the IED, the improvised explosive device, the roadside bomb. Cheap, crude, and devastating. These bombs shredded Humvees and convoys, tearing apart flesh and bone. They became the insurgents' weapon of choice and the soldier's nightmare. But the war brain saw them differently. To it, the IED was a scalpel. Each explosion created a body to be studied. Limbs torn away, torsos ripped open, heads concussed. Thousands survived because battlefield medicine had improved since Vietnam, and each survival became a case study. Surgeons refined their techniques. Tourniquets were redesigned. Prosthetics advanced by decades. The roadside bomb was not just a weapon, it was a curriculum. Industry reawakens. Just as in World War II, industry was mobilized. Drone warfare expanded from prototype to mass deployment. Night vision became standard. Body armor improved. Communication systems grew seamless. Satellites tracked every move. Ford had once built a bomber every hour in World War II. Now American factories built armored vehicles, MRAPs, mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles, in endless supply to counter roadside bombs. Each insurgent attack generated not despair, but contracts. Each dead soldier created new funding. The war brain turned loss into leverage. The Iraq War killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Civilians, soldiers, insurgents. Some estimates run past 1 million. Whole cities were reduced to rubble. Refugees streamed into neighboring states, carrying trauma, language, and genes with them. The war brain got what it always seeks: movement, mixing, chaos, and the expansion of the human experiment. American soldiers died by the thousands, but even in death, they served. Their bodies justified budgets. Their sacrifice bound their comrades tighter. Their wounds filled medical journals. Humans ask, Was this war justified? Did it make America safer? Did it spread democracy? The answer was irrelevant. The war brain had already collected its payment. What was learned? From these wars came a cascade of lessons that spread far beyond the battlefield. Trauma medicine leapt forward, with rapid blood transfusion protocols, advanced prosthetics, and brain injury treatments that are now standard in civilian hospitals. Drone technology, perfected in Iraqi skies, now dominates surveillance and combat worldwide. Cyber warfare, electronic jamming, and information. Operations became essential tools of statecraft, and psychologically, entire populations learned to live under surveillance, checkpoints, and the normalization of permanent war. The war brain harvested every drop of experience, every ounce of fear. Reflection. The theater never ends. From the towers of Manhattan to the deserts of Iraq, from roadside bombs to prosthetic laboratories, the story of 9/11 and its aftermath is not tragedy, not justice, not even history. It is theater. Theater staged by the war brain, with humans as actors who never see the script. The towers fell because spectacle was needed. Armies marched because fear was needed. Roadside bombs detonated because data was needed. Limbs were lost because prosthetics were needed. Civilians died because mixing was needed. And all along leaders proclaimed freedom, justice, security, the same illusions the war brain has used for millennia. The wars after 9/11 did not just pit West against East, Christian against Muslim. They tore Islam against itself. Sunnis and Shia, once children of the same prophet, tore each other to pieces in Baghdad, Fallujah, Damascus, Mosul. The irony could not be sharper. Muhammad, who dreamed of unity under God, whose revelations thundered with the oneness of belief, left behind followers who would butcher each other over who had the right to interpret his legacy. Humans call this schism theology. They write long treatises about succession disputes after the Prophet's death, about Ali and Abu Bakr, about caliphs and imams. But the war brain doesn't deal in theology. It deals in division. It whispers in one ear, "You are the true believers." It whispers in another, "They are imposters." Suddenly, neighbors become enemies. Families fracture. Mosques burn. What could be more absurd? The Muslims killing Muslims. And yet, what could be more useful to the war brain? Because when a faith fractures, the longing intensifies. Each group defines itself more sharply, more violently. Martyrdom multiplies. And as bodies fall, the cycle of vengeance becomes eternal. The Americans invaded Iraq in 2003, thinking they would topple a dictator and plant democracy. Instead, the war brain turned the invasion into a petri dish of sectarian hatred. Sunni extremists bombed Shia shrines. Shia militias slaughtered Sunni civilians. Whole neighborhoods of Baghdad were ethnically cleansed. Car bombs tore marketplaces apart. For the war brain, this was pure efficiency. One population, one religion, one language, and still it found a way to split them into camps of hatred. And the irony deepened. Muslims fought jihad not only against Americans, but against other Muslims. Al-Qaeda denounced Shia as heretics. Shia militias denounced Sunnis as traitors. In Syria, the so-called Islamic State massacred both, convinced that only their faction represented the will of God. Every suicide bomber who walked into a mosque full of fellow Muslims was proof of the OS's mastery. Believers so convinced of their righteousness that they would blow themselves apart to kill those who bowed to the same God. Muhammad could never have imagined this. Or perhaps he did, and that is the cruelest part of all. For what is the Quran but a text like every other war brain creation, a scripture that inspires unity only to sharpen division? Muslims chant Allahu Akbar as they slaughter other Muslims who chant the same words. The war brain smiles. The irony is delicious. Humans will say this is politics. They will say it is geopolitics, oil, dictatorships, foreign meddling, and they are not wrong. But beneath every explanation lies the deeper truth. The war brain never lets unity last. It will infiltrate even the most sacred creed, even the most pious heart, and turn brother against brother. That is the hidden genius of the OS. It does not only trick enemies into hating each other, it tricks friends. It tricks families. It tricks believers into slaughtering those who share their faith. No greater proof of control could be imagined. Laboratories in the sand. The smoke drifted east across the Atlantic, and the war brain exhaled. The towers had done their job. The cameras were packed away, the funeral scheduled, the flags folded into tight blue triangles. Now the longer work could begin. A spectacle ignites, a campaign educates. Afghanistan first, then Iraq. 2 vast classrooms with no walls. 2 deserts wired for electricity, telemetry, and lesson plans written in shrapnel. Deployment is the war brain's favorite verb. Men and women in uniform moved by the hundreds of thousands. Cargo jets disgorged pallets of gauze, blood bags, radios, and batteries. Engineers rolled out forward operating bases like pop-up cities, the map filled with acronyms and coordinates. Every tent, every checkpoint, every convoy became an instrument on a lab bench. The syllabus was simple. Break the body, then learn how to keep it alive. Break logistics, then learn how to stitch them back together faster than they can be cut. Break a society, then learn which fragments can be monitored, mapped, and moved. The roadside bomb did most of the teaching. A buried charge under sun-baked dirt. A garage door opener as trigger. A copper plate formed into a molten lance by an explosively shaped charge. Crude, cheap, omnipresent. It sheared limbs, drove blast waves through sinuses and skulls, peppered arteries with debris you could not see on first scan. The bomb's lesson was repetition. Again and again the same physics, the same carnage, the same narrow window to act. Medics learned to count seconds, not minutes. Apply tourniquet high and tight. Pack the wound. Keep the airway. Push blood early. Move now. From this repetition came doctrine. Tactical combat casualty care matured from a checklist into an instinct. The golden hour stopped being a slogan and became a global logistics requirement. Helicopters idled in heat shimmer, waiting for the call. Dust-offs learned to thread through brownout and tracer fire. Forward surgical teams rehearsed for arrivals they knew by the sound of rotors and the smell of JP-8. Whole bases were choreographed around that hour. Radios, flight crews, surgeons, blood refrigeration, CT scanners in trailers, oxygen, suction, suture. The war brain loves choreography because choreography scales. Survival curves bent upward. In earlier wars, the same injuries were a sentence. In these wars, they became a question. Lives that would have vanished on a dirt road outside Fallujah now continued inside a fluorescent bright tent 10 minutes later. And because they continued, the next tier of learning opened. How to salvage a mangled limb. When to amputate early to prevent infection that would cost a life later. How to manage blast-induced brain injury when the scan looks clean, but the lights inside the mind flicker and dim. How to control hemorrhage with powdered agents, junctional tourniquets, pelvic binders. How to run damage control resuscitation with balanced blood products instead of flooding a torn system with clear fluids that only dilute the chance to live. Prosthetics accelerated. Carbon fiber feet that spring instead of sag. Microprocessor knees that read the ground 100 times a second. Targeted muscle reinnervation. So a forearm lost on Highway 1 in Helmand can someday open and close a bionic hand by thought. The war brain never cares whether the new limb is built for walking a child to school or sprinting down a track at the Paralympics. It cares that a supply chain learned to fabricate, fit, revise, and refit at scale. It cares that clinics learn to accompany a human for years, trading sockets and liners, the way a body trades cells. Brains demanded a different curriculum. Blast waves travel through bone and water with perverse grace. Many walked away from the crater, laughing, shaking off dust, insisting they were fine. Then the headaches began. The sleep fractured. The memory stuttered. Anger came on fast, like lightning. The war brain does something unusual here. It allows a sliver of mercy, disguised as curiosity. Teams at Landstuhl, Bethesda, San Antonio, and university partners documented the invisible. New imaging modalities parsed white matter. Neuropsych batteries tracked attention, impulse control, executive function. Protocols emerged for graded return to duty, for vestibular rehab, for headache clinics, for family counseling that faced down the sentence no one wants to say out loud. The person who came home is not the person who left. Psychiatry relearned old lessons with new statistics. Post-traumatic stress is not weakness. It is a nervous system, doing what it evolved to do. Under pressures, it was never built to metabolize endlessly. Evidence-based therapies sharpened, exposure protocols refined. EMDR left fringe status and moved toward mainstream. Medications were sorted into what helps and what only fogs the day. Suicide prevention shifted from slogans to lethal means safety, peer support, sleep repair, and relentless follow-up. The war brain, indifferent to individual anguish, nonetheless logged the procedural gains. Civilian trauma systems copied them quietly. Accident victims, shooting survivors, abused children benefited from windows pried open by men who met IEDs in the dark. The hardware learned as quickly as the hospitals. MRAPs replaced thin-skinned transports. V-shaped hulls threw blasts outward, buying hearts a few more beats. The lesson rippled through design bureaus and budget committees. Weight is life. Clearance is life. Seat design is life. Even the bolts learned something. A bolt can be chosen to fail in a blast, sacrificing metal so a spine does not snap. Armor kits swapped monthly as insurgents iterated fuses and charges. Counter-IED warfare became a discipline, with analysts, modelers, route clearance convoys, electronic warfare that reached invisibly into the spectrum to smother signals before a thumb could press a trigger. Above, predators and reapers traced lazy ovals. Pilots learned to fly by cursor and satellite link, 8,000 miles from the heat and the smell. Lawyers sat close, the lattice of rules tightening with each strike. The war brain likes rules. They create the illusion of leash, while the dog still runs. Drones did more than strike. They watched. Hours became dossiers. Patterns of life became grids and heat maps. The habit of watching everything bled home. License plate readers multiplied. Cell-side simulators proliferated. The boundary between battlefield and boulevard thinned, like paper left too long in the sun. Supply chains hardened, then softened, then learned to flex. Afghanistan taught what it means to feed a base at the end of the world, where the road is a rumor and the pass is snowed in. Iraq taught what it means to move fuel and water through a city that hates you in the morning and sells you bread at noon. Convoys became arteries. When they were cut, aircraft stood in. When aircraft were too scarce, improvisation turned waste into resources. Solar arrays sprouted on HESCO walls. Water was reclaimed in ways municipalities would steal a decade later. The war brain is most content when logistics offices discover that resilience is not a press release, but a pallet on time. Civilian medicine adopted the war's harvest. Tourniquets that once gathered dust in supply closets migrated onto police belts and into elementary schools. Stop the Bleed classes taught teenagers how to pinch an artery while waiting for the siren. Trauma centers shifted transfusion strategies and stocked thawed plasma. ERS bought handheld ultrasound and trained hands to find free fluid in a belly without calling a radiologist in from home. Stroke teams leveraged the same time discipline, door to needle, door to clot retrieval. The golden hour generalized. Cyber and comms ran their own course. Encrypted radios that shrug at dust and heat set expectations for clarity the public now demands from smartphones. Mesh networks assembled in minutes became templates for disaster zones after hurricanes and earthquakes. Even the culture of after-action learning spread. Root cause analysis for a failed resupply convoy looks a lot like a morbidity and mortality conference for a missed diagnosis. In both, the only unforgivable sin is to pretend nothing happened. None of this redeems the cost. The war brain tallies in ledgers humans cannot read. What it calls return on investment looks like a mother's folded hands on a flag-draped coffin. But if you insist on seeing how the machine works, you must look where the machine insists you do not. War did not only kill, it taught. It taught us to move blood faster. It taught us to listen to symptoms that have no scan. It taught us to design vehicles that prefer a crushed axle to a crushed thorax. It taught prosthetists to listen to skin as a living sensor. It taught coders to compress video so a feed can slip through a thin straw of bandwidth and still show a heartbeat at a distance. And it taught an older lesson under a new light. Every method perfected under fire longs to be used for peace. A medevac pilot is a future disaster relief lifeline. A field hospital is a blueprint for earthquake triage. A prosthetic lab is a promise to a child born without a limb that her first steps will not hurt. The war brain does not care whether the downstream application is merciful. It cares that the technique exists, that it can be summoned when needed, that the species is better at doing under pressure what it could once only dream of on paper. The strategy people will insist this was avoidable. They will say the same lessons could have been learned without the sand and the funerals. They may be right. The war brain will shrug. It has never believed humans learn voluntarily at scale. It believes they learn when they must, and it is very skilled at arranging must. You can argue with that cynicism, or you can notice what it has produced and decide to reroute it. The medics, surgeons, pilots, logisticians, analysts, and engineers already prove they can change protocols in months if the signal is urgent enough. The question is whether a civilization can generate that signal without detonating something first. When Americans finally left the great classrooms, they did not leave empty-handed. They brought home limbs that end in carbon fiber and minds that sometimes wake at 3 a.m. to an explosion only they can hear. They brought home checklists that belong in every ambulance and radios that belong in every flood zone. They brought home a sense that minutes matter and that the right equipment in the right hands at the right time is the difference between a photo on a mantle and a laugh at a kitchen table. They also brought home the ache of knowing how quickly a society can get used to a forever war and how hard it is to stop when the machine has learned to feed itself. The war brain is not sentimental. It looks at the long arc and asks only whether the species became faster at improvising, better at stabilizing, more practiced at absorbing trauma without collapsing. On those metrics, the wars met their benchmarks. That is a grim sentence to write. It is grimmer to deny it. The only useful response is to decide, deliberately, that the next harvest will come from drills, simulations, competitions, and peaceful rivalries that squeeze the same urgency out of a clock without having to pour blood into the gears. You can hear the war brain object. It will say, humans are not built that way, that they require spectacle, that they only move when afraid. It will tempt leaders to reach for the fire bell because the fire bell works. If you want to prove it wrong, you will have to build institutions that reward the same speed and discipline in calm that war rings out in chaos. You will have to make a golden hour for everything that matters and treat missing it as unacceptable, no matter how quiet the day. The sand kept the secrets it always keeps. The tire tracks have already blown smooth. The blast craters fill with spring weeds when the rain is generous. Somewhere, a boy who learned to throw a tourniquet with one hand is teaching his daughter to ride a bike. Somewhere, a woman who learned to land a helicopter in a brownout is coaching a community team on how to evacuate a flooded neighborhood, street by street. The laboratories are closed. The lessons are everywhere. The question is whether we are willing to keep them lit without asking the war brain to turn the power back on with another great burning.